Syria, where the government was toppled by rebel forces after more than a decade of unrest and civil war. What comes next, however, could be even worse. Capital of Damascus fell over the weekend. Along with it, the House of Assad, which ruled over Syria for more than 50 years, often brutally, as evidenced by the thousands of political prisoners who were freed from jails and torture chambers amid the rebels' march to Damascus. Syria's now former president, Bashar al-Assad, waged a military campaign of retribution against restive portions of the population that rose up during the Arab Spring in 2011. The resulting civil war led to the deaths of over 500,000 people and millions more displaced, many of whom are now returning home. Assad managed to hang on to power thanks in large part to military support from Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, and for a few years recently, it appeared as though he had achieved a total victory in his civil war over the rebels. But in the lull in fighting, Assad still refused to pursue popular reforms to shore up support among the citizenry. And when the rebels regrouped to again threaten his regime, Assad found his backers tied up in other conflicts, Russia and Ukraine, and Iran and Hezbollah resisting Israel's genocide in Gaza. Alone and with a tired army, Assad secretly fled the country before the opposition closed in, and he and his family were given asylum in Russia. He still hasn't spoken publicly since. One day before the rebels overran Damascus, President-elect Donald Trump posted about how the U.S. needs to stay out of the conflict. Quote, "Syria is a mess, but is not our friend, and the United States should have nothing to do with it. This is not our fight. Let it play out. Do not get involved." Yeah, let's just let it play out. After we've spent more than a decade working directly to overthrow Assad. I mean, this is all pretty rich coming from the guy who, as president, actually ordered the U.S. military to bomb Syrian government positions in order to aid the rebels. Whether Trump wants to admit it or not, U.S. fingerprints are all over the ouster of Assad, as are Israel's and NATO ally Turkey's. It is the culmination of a long-running campaign for regime change in Damascus by the foreign policy blob in Washington, which viewed Assad as an animal. Not because he brutalized his own people, of course not. That's tolerable to the State Department. But instead because Assad opposed imperial interventions in the region and was a strong ally of Russia. It was for those reasons he had to go. And cables released by WikiLeaks show State Department discussions about destabilizing the Assad government as far back as 2006, with officials citing the presence of Islamic extremists in the country as an increasing threat to Assad's rule. Sanctions were placed on the Assad government. Then, after civil war broke out, covert support for Syrian rebels was authorized by former President Obama. And that covert support eventually turned overt when Obama said in 2013 that Assad must go. Clearly, having learned zero lessons from the disaster unfolding in Libya, where U.S. and NATO forces had just helped rebels depose Muammar Gaddafi and unleashed hell and warlordism on the country. That lesson being, what comes next can always be worse. The Pentagon provided weapons and money to the Syrian opposition, which was dominated by extremist fighters, including former members and leadership of al-Qaeda. In fact, the faction that led the rebels' takeover of Damascus is known as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, which the U.S. State Department considers a terrorist organization, and whose leader was formerly a member of al-Qaeda. Although Washington is now considering removing HTS from its list of terror groups, I guess now that it's allied with HTS. HTS has already gained infamy during the war for crushing dissent among the local population in areas where it's operated, and also for running torture prisons. So, In Syria, the U.S. supported the same extremists who the U.S. had been fighting since 9/11. Of course, those were also the same extremists who the U.S. previously armed when they fought against a different Russian-backed government in Afghanistan in the 1980s. That story ended where this one begins. Today, the Syrian people are for good reason celebrating the end of not just a dictatorship, but also the end of one of the worst civil wars in modern history. But the future is uncertain, especially for minority populations in the country who could be targeted by a more religious extremist government. The US and Israel intend to have an influence on whatever happens. The US maintains a troop presence of about 900 soldiers in Syria, mainly to guard oil fields. It also routinely executes airstrikes against purported Islamic State militants operating in the country, militants who are also fighting Assad. In fact, the US has carried out scores of bombings across Syria in the days since Assad fell. And Israel has used the chaos to seize more land from Syria. The IDF rolled tanks and troops into Syria's Golan Heights and also bombed several targets across the country. Assad's removal from power prompted the U.S. to pretend to care about international law again. The U.S. Justice Department announced war crimes charges against Syrian officials, and the U.S. State Department said that it would support the International Criminal Court bringing Bashar al-Assad to justice, a claim that triggered mocking laughter from reporters attending the department press briefing.
The president said yesterday that the Assad regime, or Assad himself, should be held accountable. Will you support his application to stand in front of the ICC as a war criminal who committed crimes against humanity?
So we support the work of the ICC. I know that obviously we have disagreed with their hold on. I'm gonna let me address it.
You support the work of the ICC until they do something about it.
So we have had a long. Let me just answer the question.
Look, the U.S. is going to keep doing whatever it wants because it has nukes, and for now, the world still relies on its currency. But at the very least, nobody is buying Washington's bullshit anymore. Hey, thanks for watching. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any of our new videos. Also, if you want to see Means Morning News in its complete form, not just the clips we post here, head on over to Means TV and get access to all our new episodes and our entire backlog, plus tons of other great movies and original TV shows.